today's program, in Israel, will voters go to the polls on National Election Day? The sitting Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is facing perhaps the toughest election campaign of his long political career. In this election, 40-odd political parties are vying for a spot in Israel's 120-seat parliament. Who's leading the polls? Is the election going to change the political landscape in the region? Before our discussion, take a look.
Hard politicking, external support, gimmicks, and close to 100 surveys. Israelis cast their votes on Tuesday after 4 months of campaigning described as exhausting, aggressive, and exceptionally thorny.
I'm going to be voting for blue and white, Benny Gantz.
I'm voting for Netanyahu, the Likud party.
This time I'm confused because, to be honest, I'm not happy with most of the parties.
I'm still not certain who I'm going to vote for.
Numbers show this is Israel's tightest election in years. Prime Minister Netanyahu's Likud party is trying to hang on to its edge. Netanyahu has been in office for a decade now, and the elections could hand him a record 5th term. He has rallied a far-right camp hardened against the Palestinians and played up Israeli foreign policy boons that are exemplified in his ties with the Trump administration. Under the Trump administration, the U.S. has formally recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights. Many believe Netanyahu's far-right policies are one of the causes for the neck-and-neck election. The Prime Minister has been in what many see as a mad dash ahead of the elections on Monday, promising to annex the West Bank.
I must tell you there was no quandary, but this is a sacred act, the meaning of democracy. We are blessed with it, but one must choose good. I can't say what. I can, but I don't want to. Not here. With God's help, the state of Israel will win. Thank you all. Go and vote.
Former General Benny Gantz is the incumbent's biggest rival, who has pledged a cleaner government and more social cohesion. He's the leader of the Blue and White Coalition, a political alliance formed ahead of the elections.
This is a day of hope, a day of unity. I look into everyone's eyes and know that we can connect. I know we can unite, and I am glad I can serve the citizens of the state of Israel, so we can rise to a new way.
More than 40 parties are vying for the 120 seats in the one-chamber parliament. Over 6 million Israeli citizens across the country are eligible to vote. Who they cast their vote for hinges on identity politics. A fifth of voters are Arab residents of Israel. More than half say they won't vote due to a lack of parties addressing their needs. Ultra-Orthodox Jews tend to go with right-wing parties who will strengthen their standing. Preferences aside, polls show that more than a quarter of voters don't trust the election process. A victory may not be decided immediately. Days or even weeks of coalition negotiations lie ahead.
For more on Israel's latest election, we are joined in Tel Aviv by Meir Danvar, who is a lecturer and analyst on the Middle East, and in our Beijing studio, Zhou Rong, a senior fellow of the Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies of Renmin University. Welcome to both of you, gentlemen. Well, Mr. Danvar, go to you first. Will the Likud party, led by Prime Minister Netanyahu, really have a bigger win than most of the poll would suggest?
One thing we learned from the previous elections in Israel is that it's difficult to rely on the polls. The last election, the polls got it completely wrong. So, yes, I'm going to quote the polls, but it comes with the caveat that the polls got it wrong the last time. So with that caveat, it shows, the polls today show that, yes, he's likely to have something like, although his Likud party is only like to get 30 mandates compared to opposition blue and white getting 29 mandates, but the coalition of the right-wing groups is likely to be bigger in these elections, and Prime Minister Netanyahu has done his utmost recently by traveling to Moscow, by traveling to Washington, all in the same month, by inviting the president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, to visit Israel. We see it all in his election campaign videos. And of course, him being received by Sultan Qaboos openly, the Sultan of Oman. This is all a huge boon for the Prime Minister, which makes him, he makes him a difficult figure to beat in these elections.
Well, Mr. Joe, what do you make of it?
I think I can hardly say we are sure that the Prime Minister Netanyahu will succeed, but I can be sure that this Mr. Gantz is very, very difficult. Even he take a lead in the first round, but the second one, never he would like to establish the coalition government against Netanyahu. It is very, very hard for him to get 51 seats for his coalition. But for Netanyahu, his right wing and the far right wing, it is easy for them to get 63 to 69 seats. So mostly, I think Netanyahu will become the Prime Minister again, and will be the longest Prime Minister in the Israel's history.
But of course, Mr. Javan-Danfar, on the other hand, Mr. Netanyahu is facing quite a number of corruption cases.
Correct. He could, as my colleague in the studio rightly said, he could become the longest-serving Prime Minister in the history of Israel, but his term could be the shortest term for a Prime Minister if he wins in the next term. The reason being that in the middle of July he has a hearing for the 3 cases that he's being investigated for. And if the hearing doesn't go well, if he can't convince the judges not to issue an indictment, which it's likely he won't be able to do that, he will get indictment for 3 different cases. That's a hell of a lot on the plate of one person who is not a Prime Minister, but it's going to be even more for somebody who is a Prime Minister, and of course a Prime Minister of Israel with so much happening. So there is the possibility that he may have to step down in the middle of July.
Will that have an impact on him? I mean, not only the corruption cases for this election, but also the fact that even if he were being elected as a Prime Minister, because of those corruption cases, he could have bigger chance of facing political crisis and therefore bring the country to another verge of having another Prime Minister. Will that give him more points or much fewer points this time in the election? Will people think that far?
Well, you know, people, well, if the Israeli judiciary decides that he has to stand for election, then it won't matter how well he's done. He'll have to stand in court just like any other Israeli citizen will have to. I think what could happen, a scenario we should not overrule, is that if Netanyahu has to step down, we could see a coalition between his party and the opposition. We could see a coalition between Likud and the Blue and White Party. The Blue and White Party, the opposition, have got former members of the Likud among them. And I think, you know, it could be a good match between them, but without Netanyahu. And if that would be the case, I think that is actually much more needed in Israel. We need some much-needed bipartisan look at some of the serious issues we are witnessing within the country, our infrastructure, our health system, our education system. So I think that's a scenario that we could see that actually could work out to be in Israel's interest.
Mr. Joe?
Yeah, but I have a slightly different opinion. So what I'm saying is that is the voters may think that 3 pending cases, such as we call that scandal, may be motivated, political motivated, or we can say of what we say neglectable. So that is the voter may still think Netanyahu is very important because under his stewardship, that Israel's economy is growing and thriving very fast. Not only that, but also everybody from the right to the left also think his caution on peace process is warranted.
Prime Minister Netanyahu is well known for his hard lines, including on issues, you know, the relations between Israel and Palestine, the Golan Heights, the Iran nuclear issue, and as well as the Syria crisis. So, Mr. Javad Danfar, what do you make of that? If he is being re-elected as a prime minister, where Israel is going from here?
Well, if he manages to pass a law between April 10th, if he wins, and July that says the prime minister cannot be prosecuted, which is unlikely, but if that's the case and he doesn't have to stand down, then I think it's going to be continuation of the same, exact continuation of the same. It could become even worse. We could see, perhaps, I mean, this is a worst case scenario, but this is a worry for us that after the Golan was annexed, they could start saying that parts of the West Bank are annexed. We could see, on Iran, I think we're likely to see continuation of Israeli attacks against Iranian positions in Syria. And to be honest with you, if Gantz, the opposition leader, is elected, he's going to have the same stance when it comes to Iran's presence in Syria, and is not likely to change much when it comes to Iran's nuclear program. So to be honest with you, I think on all issues, it's basically if Netanyahu's elected, it's continuation of the same, but if the opposition is elected, they will make a more concerted effort to reach a deal with the PLO, because the opposition really knows that by making such an effort, Israel has a lot to gain in terms of improving its relation with Saudi Arabia and other Persian Gulf countries, and it's very important to them.
I see. Mr. Javad Danfar, you know, the conventional wisdom inside Israel earlier about the arguments for peace is that with peace, or possibility for peace, or at least efforts made by Israel that could be apparent to the others for peace, could provide more guarantee of security for Israel, as well as there will be less anger and less resent against Israel from the Arab world. So will that still stand? Do you think the voters still buy into that logic anymore?
You know, as a supporter of peace and a supporter and somebody who recognizes the right of people of Palestine to have a state next to the state of Israel, I have to tell you, after the second Intifada, the bus bombings, the argument, as you said, is exactly what Israel's Labour Party said when they were supporting giving land for peace, and this is something I supported. But the facts on the ground were different. You know, as Israel was giving more and more land away, there were more and more suicide bombings on the streets of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. So the argument of land for peace became actually inverted. Instead of giving Israelis more security, it was giving them less security. The issue of Gaza withdrawal. We were occupying Gaza without a shadow of a doubt. We withdrew from Gaza, and what do we get soon? We get Hamas firing rockets. This is a threat we didn't have before. So those of us in Israel, like myself, who believe that Palestine must have an independent state, we are severely weakened when we give land back and the Palestinian hardliners take advantage of that and they attack Israelis. But they're not the only ones who are also guilty. You know, the Israelis, you know, every time we have Prime Minister Abbas in the West Bank, his security cooperation with Israel has been unprecedented. But what do? We humiliate him by taking, you know, by expanding settlements. So Israelis, Palestinians and Israeli politicians, hardliners have actually with their policies have strengthened the hardliners and weakened the moderates.
A lot of things entangled. As a result of that, we are also joined in Washington, D.C. by Joe Rubin, the president of the Washington Strategy Group, who is also former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. Now, Mr. Rubin, welcome to the program to you. The U.S., particularly the Trump administration, gives one gift after another to Prime Minister Netanyahu. How much will that be a guarantee or relatively a negative impact on Mr. Netanyahu's political future in recent election?
Well, it's wonderful to be here and to be with Meir as well. And these are gifts, as you just described. Certainly in the near term, Israelis like the idea that the United States supports Israeli control of the Golan Heights. They like that the American embassy is in Jerusalem, and they may very well value that at the polls. But the danger here is that the United States has we've put ourselves in a box that we can't get out of. There is nothing left in terms of benefits that we can use as part of a multilateral negotiation, or even pushing the two sides between the Israelis and the Palestinians back to some kind of engagement. And so we have very little. Now, interestingly, a couple of weeks ago, when Jared Kushner spoke about the possibility of borders being discussed as part of his final deal push, it really reverberated hard on the Israeli right, and there was a lot of concern. So it doesn't seem to me like any of these moves by the Trump administration have brought any goodwill amongst the hard right in Israel. So really, we're in a situation where we're just playing into the hard right's hands, and that's very dangerous for long-term peace.
Is there any way, Mr. Rubin, that once, for example, Prime Minister Netanyahu back in power once again as the Prime Minister, things are likely to ease somewhat? Would the U.S. still be able to take back the spilled water, as they say?
No, I think that we're seeing the direction of where the water is flowing. I think we could, in fact, see a validated Benjamin Netanyahu after all of the pressure that he's been under, all of the indictment concerns about his corruption, and then to see him potentially win and become prime minister again. Despite all that, we may very well see a move to have Israel potentially annex parts of the West Bank, and the United States would do very little to resist that. And that's the deep fear, is that Israel will finally move to a position where it says it has American backing for complete unilateral movements on the West Bank, and that would render the Palestinians stateless for time interminable, and that's the real danger here.
Right. Mr. Zhou, two issues. One is that it seems what has been suggested, U.S. has already sacrificed its limited credibility on the Middle East issue as a result of the recent decision by the Trump administration. And other than that, there's likely to be more reactions and interactions as a result of it among the Middle East countries toward the United States or among themselves. So, Mr. Zhou, as an observer from our side, how do you see the latest situation?
I think that even
Mr. Zhou, please.
Okay. Even President Trump thinks that he is stand together with Prime Minister Netanyahu on the far right of Israel's Netanyahu coalition. I mean, far right wing may not be satisfied. So the coalition government will just face some challenge, whether they will say no to Trump's some of the aspects of his final deal or not. On the other hand, the good thing for Israel is not isolated as it used to be. It has some connection with the Gulf country, except Kuwait. Most of the Gulf countries show the interest to establish normal relationship with Israel. But some other major players like Iran and Turkey, they may still have certain kind of hostile feeling towards in this way or that way.
Right.
So I think the pressure may also be very strong. Even Netanyahu get a chance to be the next term's prime minister again.
All right. Mr. Rubin, your thought on this as well?
Well, my read on the way the Trump administration has dealt with the Middle East in the last 2 years related to Israel and Palestine is to work closely with the Saudis and other countries to try to get them on board with a plan. But we saw this all blow up in smoke after the Golan Heights announcement, when the Saudis, the Qataris, the Emiratis, countries that are not on the same page on many issues, jointly condemned this decision. So there's a real limit within the Arab politics to how far they will go on pushing the Palestinians to peace if the Palestinians don't want to go there. I think we saw that it's very sensitive, that the Arabs are not in any easy mood to give Israel benefits without anything in return, and I think that that's what the White House was banking on, and it's just not there.
Mr. Javadanfar?
Look, I think, to be honest, well, this is not my opinion, this is a fact. In the right-wing Israeli camp, they are very worried about what President Trump has in order. Because, you know, they could turn down President Obama. We saw that even the Prime Minister Netanyahu used a video of him lecturing President Obama in order to get more votes in Israel. But confronting Trump, it's not going to be easy. So, you know, there is concern about the Trump peace plan, and I think it's possible that in the first term, if Trump is elected, in the first term Trump won't do much because he has to restand for elections again. And 25% of Americans are evangelical, and it's a huge voting bloc. It's a bigger voting bloc than the Jewish vote in America. But in the second term, if Trump is re-elected, I think we could see actually a bust-up. We could see a major clash on this issue between Netanyahu and Trump.
Not only between Netanyahu and Trump, probably the impact of the recent policy will be also apparent then as time goes by. Mr. Rubin, I'm afraid it's not going to be very beautiful.
No, and the Palestinians have been so disenfranchised politically in the last several years that for them to come back in any meaningful political way is very hard to imagine if we continue in the trajectory, that we're on. These facts on the ground in the Middle East, it's an axiom. Once you have facts, they don't get uprooted. And facts on the ground about Jerusalem, the Golan Heights, potential annexation will be incredibly difficult to roll back and make it even harder to imagine the Palestinians come to some kind of negotiated two-state compromise that we've been talking about for the past couple of decades.
Well, Mr. Zhou, of course, the Israel-Palestine relation is a crystallization, in fact, about how much capability the world has in terms of trying to settle down a conflict or a crisis. Obviously, it has not been doing very well recently. What does it say about us? And that as an example for the other crises already existing and likely to happen in the near future.
Actually, I think the Palestinian people think they are becoming weaker and weaker, and there's no solution for the two states. So that is to say, United Nations need to do more than ever before to just get both Israel and the Palestinians together, no matter whether the Hamas or Fatah or whatever they are. But I think the negotiation and the dialogue is the only way to just salute.
Well, you could say so. Yeah, the realities are very different right now. Mr. Rubin, with a re-election, if possible, of Mr. Netanyahu in the office, will any of the things Mr. Zhou just beautifully described ever happen, besides what the UN can do?
Right. I think Benjamin Netanyahu, if he wins, he will feel that his strategy of rejecting pressure from Obama is a good example, who was trying to put some lines in there about Israeli behavior. That rejection by Netanyahu and then the support from President Trump would embolden him, if anything, and really reduce his incentive to negotiate with the Palestinians.
Mr. Javad Danvar?
I have a different take on the matter.
Go ahead, sir.
To be honest with you, the issue of Palestine is not important in this region, unfortunately. It's lost its position, it has lost its prominence. Iranian involvement in Lebanon, in Syria, and especially in Yemen and also in Iraq has taken focus away from the issue of Palestine. And most of the Arab countries, they are much more focused on that issue. And this has helped Israel tremendously. On the Golan Heights, the Arabs, the Persian Gulf countries condemned it. This was a very diluted condemnation, and that's about it. Russia condemned, but now we see President Putin hosting Netanyahu with much pomp and ceremony. So, the messages that the Israeli right wing get is not just the issue of Trump being pro-Israel, it's just that in the international arena, and especially in the Middle East, the focus is no longer on the issue of Palestine.
We'll see how things evolve from here about that election after it, particularly. Thank you so much, three of you, Zhou Rong, Zhou Rubin, and Mayor Javad Danvar. Really appreciate it. Thank you, gentlemen.